Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, The Inked Reader. Today I am filming a video that I wanted to do for a while, and I thought Halloween was a perfect excuse to do so, but I wanted to kind of speak about my favorite horror books in general. I was thinking in my mind, maybe I should say over the last few years. Reality is I've not read horror all my life. It's something that I've started to read more intensely, if you want, in the last few years, 3 years specifically, 4 years, and before I just read a couple. So yeah, it's my favorite horrors of all time, just because I don't have a kind of backlist. I don't have a huge backlist of them. Now, these are not the only horror I've enjoyed, however, are definitely my top 10. Said that, I didn't want to be repetitive because I've seen a lot of videos going online about recommendations for Halloween, and a lot of the titles that I would have put in this list are actually all over the place on BookTube, so I want to include them very quickly, just mentioning the titles. That's to say, those are still probably my favorite horror. Like, they are definitely included in my favorite horror ever, but I'm not gonna go into any synopsis just because probably you are tired of hearing these titles. But I do wanna give a very honorable mention, and I would definitely say that those are my favorite horror as well. So my list would be around 14, but those four, the ones I'm about to show you, I generally think that you've heard of them so many times that you don't need me to come here and do a synopsis. So I'm just gonna mention these four ones, and then we're gonna go into the top 10. But again, it would be a top 14, okay? And this probably would be at the very first places. So of course I am absolutely obsessed with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley and Dracula. These are also my favorite classics ever. So those two, Frankenstein and Dracula, if you've not read them, please do so. No better excuse than Halloween to do so. And also very popular ones, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, perfect gothic novel, the emblem, if you want, the staple when it comes down to gothic fiction. For me, it's Rebecca. And finally, my favorite king would be The Shining. However, I do also want to mention Pet Sematary, and It has absolutely my favorite works by Stephen King. The Shining is top, but Pet Sematary and It are very close by. So actually, considering Pet Sematary and It to be a top 16. So having those first 6 out of the way that you've heard a million times, let's go into the other books I want to share with you, my other top 10 horror of all time. I decided to also kind of do a mixture of books I generally loved and horror. So all of these books either sit in the genre that is horror, or they sit in a very like thriller horror, so they're kind of on the cusp of being horror books. All of them have some spooky elements. However, this is not a list of the most disturbing books I've ever read in my life. I have done different videos about the most disturbing books ever written, or I've read your recommendations and what I found most disturbing, so I'm gonna link all of those books down below. But I generally try to make a mixture of, I generally enjoyed a lot of these books and had a lot of horror elements in it, but they're not necessarily the most disturbing, horrifying things ever. We're gonna, for example, start on with The Diviners by Lisa Bray, which is like a YA. It's spooky, but it's a YA. It's definitely not the most horrifying, or I wouldn't say that you need to necessarily love horror to enjoy these. It can be spooky at times though, but it's a very mild horror element, for example. But again, when I was compiling this list of my favorite horror or books that could potentially also sit in the horror genre, these definitely came up. I got my copies up there, so I'm just going to insert a picture because I don't have a ladder with me. But this is a quartet of books. The last book was a bit shitty, I'll be really honest, but the first 3 books have been mind-blowing, and you follow this bunch of misfit, if you want, in New York in the, I believe, early 20s, so in the early 1900s, so like part of that kind of early century, and they meet for a series of events, and all of them have paranormal powers. Some can read minds, some have affinity with the elements like fire, or some of them can heal people and so on. So you got different characters, different point of views, and you follow them trying to save New York and the wider world from threats that come from ghosts and paranormal creatures, and has been absolutely a blast. This series is so entertaining. I love the characters. They're very unique and very personalized, I believe, and the way they come together, the way the story develops. Again, not the strongest end, but the first 3 books, the tension that keeps going, the element of creepiness coming in, what's gonna happen. I think Libba Bright does very good horror. She would be an amazing horror writer, actually, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I thought, if you don't know if you're too much into horror or you want something that's horror-ish, spooky, but manageable, The Diviners is a great choice. Another one, this is a classic, actually, and I loved it, and I didn't expect it. I picked it up from the library. I actually don't own a copy because I was looking for a very nice version of it. So if you have an idea, if you've purchased something like a copy of this book and you love it, or you like the cover, let me know which edition you bought, because I am on the hunt for this. But this is The Woman in Black. Yes, there is a movie. No, I've not watched the movie. I don't really do horror movies. I don't even know what to say not to spoil it. So it's a very quick read, and it's about this man has to go to his house in order to write some legal documents, and no one wants to stay in this house because of the creepy things happening, and this kind of very old mansion in the moors with nothing around. And he goes there and he starts to see this ghost, and this was absolutely creepy, and I loved the ending of this. I absolutely loved the ending of The Woman in Black, and I found it so eerie for such a quick read. So yeah, I immediately, when I was filling this list in, it's like, I need to give a spot to The Woman in Black because I generally loved the ending. So this is the only one in this list that I have read many years ago, before I was actually into horror, and this is The Exorcist. Never watched the movie, which everybody is familiar with, but I didn't want to watch the movie. I knew that at the time, and even to these days, I'm not into horror movies. Yet I love horror books, but at the time I didn't know it. I just picked it up from the library. Probably it was spooky season back then, and I decided to just go with something spooky to stay in the theme of the month. Back then I was probably, I want to say, between 16 and 17 when I picked this up, and I was mind blown from the creepiness of the story, but also how entertaining it was. I think the story has definitely some horror elements, but it's very much like a thriller mystery of what's going on with this girl. You follow this priest trying to figure out what's wrong with this girl, that it's a little girl, and all of a sudden she starts to behaving very strangely, and her mother is very worried about her, so she hires this priest to go and trying to fix things for her. And yes, there are definitely some creepy crawling scenes, some very impactful scenes, but I really enjoyed his writing and the atmosphere he created in these. And although it's been more than 10 years now, I still remember how much I enjoyed the book itself. Now, I've spoken about the next one a bunch of times on my channel, and there is a whole review on it, which is so long ago filmed. I had my old phone, the quality of the video is shitty, but I done a whole review for this, so I'm gonna link it down below. Then I got Hunted. This is the only book I own that has a parental advisory on top. This is my first Palahniuk book, and it's about this writer's retreat, and they come together, this bunch of oddly sorted and put together wannabe writers, and they need each one of them to tell a story, because each one of them is given a name, if I remember correctly. And so they're gonna tell the story of how they came to be called that way by telling a story, something of the sort. So yeah, it's a collection of short stories, but there is definitely like a overall plot. So it's sort of like the Decameron by Boccaccio situation, where you got this bunch of people. Yes, they're all telling a story, so it could also be considered like a collection of short stories, but there is this bunch of people you're following in a retreat. So there is an overall plot, if you want. And this is some of the most disgusting and yet entertaining stories I've ever read. I fell in love with Palahniuk after reading this, because I was just in awe with how much gruesomeness, but also this is satire about media and how people are looking for fame. And I found the stories, for how much odd they could be, also very entertaining and insightful in a sense. So yeah, I love Hunted by Chuck Palahniuk. I do understand this is not for everyone. I've read Fight Club by him, for example. I enjoyed it, but not as much as these. If you ask me, thus far my favorite Palahniuk is definitely these. I've read another couple of things by him, but yeah, Hunted is definitely has an element of spookiness and kind of unease. It puts you at ease. It makes you feel like sick to your stomach at times, which for some is what they want for Halloween. The next one is more mild. It's more gothic as a story. It's more the atmosphere in this, I believe, New Orleans that it's taking place, the first book at least. So it's the atmosphere it creates is Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. Never mind the movies, okay? I didn't mind the movies, I'll be honest. I was okay with the movies, but definitely can't compare with the book. Interview with the Vampire, I read so many of these. So these are a massive saga made of companion books where you follow this bunch of vampires and their stories and their origins. But the first ones, the first 2 to 3 books, you focus on the same cast of character, and there is one, I don't know, it's Lewis, what's the name? Anyway, there's a recurring character kind of throughout the series. And Interview with the Vampire, you follow this journalist who sits with this vampire, and the vampire tells him how he has become a vampire and its origin story and everything that comes with it. And I was fascinated by this, and I remember that I could really picture this kind of gloomy, eerie New Orleans, and the decadent vibes were definitely there. Yes, there is the element of vampires. These are very standard vampires. These are not Twilight vampires. They are mean, they are cold, but also they are full of suffering. It's a suffering from, you know, eternal life without feelings, without being able to appreciate human warmth. And I think Anne Rice creates one of the few vampire series that feels the most inhuman and human at the same time. It feels like these are humans who generally have had such a change and have survived such like atrocious trauma and such like a, you know, they're so far away now in time from when they were human, and the nature of these vampires and the pain that comes with it, the inner turmoil and their afflictions and conflicts really come through the pages. Is a very slow series. So I would say Interview with the Vampire is a very good Halloween book. It's a very, very good Halloween book, but maybe try a few more before you want to commit yourself to the whole series, because it can drag. Some books are dreadfully dragging. But at the same time, I see a book that's dreadfully dragging as it would be a dreadful dragging life, eternal life of a vampire that cannot die and has lived centuries and lost the meaning of life. So in a sense, I found it oddly fitting to the actual life of a vampire, the fact that these books are so slow paced and so slow in general. Anyway, Interview with the Vampire. You might not love it necessarily, but I can guarantee that it's gonna come up as a very peculiar read when it comes down to vampires. It's not your usual vampire book, and yet it's one of the most genuine vampire books, actual vampire books I can think of. Absolutely love this series overall. And the writing, I am a big fan of Anne Rice. Then I have got Summer, Fireworks, and My Corpse. I did a reading challenge a few years back when where I was reading 10 translated Japanese horror books, and this one is the only one that I generally, this one and another one that I'm gonna mention in another video, are the only two I truly enjoyed. This one in particular stood out to me because it's also a collection of short stories. Now these stories are quite lengthy, so I believe you just follow around 3 short stories, and the book is like normal length, so you know each story is given its own time and pace in order to really play out. And I remember that perhaps the first story was the weakest, but the other 2 I generally enjoyed. And there is a story where basically a girl is killed, a young girl is killed, and you follow what happens to the perpetrators of this crime from the perspective of her body, which was quite odd but interesting. And then there's also this story about this girl that gets a transplant of an eye, and then she can see the life of the previous owner. And I truly loved all the stories, and one in particular I found it so creepy, so atmospheric. I really enjoyed the translation of the writing. So yeah, if you're looking for something a bit different, maybe short stories but are quite horrific and very interesting as just a premise and plot, then definitely Summer, Fireworks and My Corpse are like an amazing collection. The next one is one that I remember the experience of reading this was so compelling. I wanted to keep reading, I wanted to find out what it was, and I read this in summer, but I cannot imagine this being any more fitting than Halloween season. So this is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. I think she's Shona Maguire, isn't she? And so this, the premise of this is that you got this bunch of people that a few years back traveled to this Mariana Trench, so one of the parts of the world where that has the deepest oceans, because they wanted to film a mockumentary about the sea creatures that were rumored to live there. So they go and then they come back, and then you follow a few protagonists a few years after this tragedy trying to put together a crew and travel back to the Mariana Trench to where the other expedition disappeared, because they did recover an audio that had very disturbing audio and very disturbing noises in the back. So they know that something tragic has happened, and they do suspect that something tragic was quite violent, but they want to find out the truth. So they put together this other crew, more equipped, more ready to find out what actually is going on. Then it's just everything else ensues. And I think what I loved about this is the part of finding out the slow building of the tension and what's actually down there, and that part was amazing. In the end, there is a lot of action. I don't necessarily love the ending to bits, I'll be really honest. I think that the first 3/4 of the book are the strongest, but it's a nice payoff overall. It was so entertaining, such a compelling read, and yeah, it's perfect for Halloween, but to be fair, it was a very nice horror to read in August as well. Okay, so the next two are probably my favorite horror books. Yes, this list overall wasn't in order, but if I have to really pinpoint the best horror books I've read in the last decade or since I started reading horror, this one would take the spot, together with the 4 that I did mention at the beginning, the very popular one, The Shining and so on. So let's start with 12 Nights at Rotherhouse. I adore this book, and I think this book is a very quiet horror that has an amazing ending in my opinion. And as someone who can guess and often don't experience the element of surprise, just because I am not always but often quite good at understanding what's happening way before it actually happens, this one worked for me wonderfully because I didn't see it coming. Basically, I didn't see the ending coming, and it was just mind-blowing when it happened. I was so pleased with the experience of reading this book. But again, it was a very slow build-up, and I think it's way more atmospheric than actually full of events. And in a sense, though, that build up, you don't know what's going on, it's so creepy, what's gonna happen. It really paid off in the end for me personally. So the premise of this is that you got this man who is a researcher, like he writes about haunted places, and so he has found out now about Rotherhouse, which is this very famous haunted house. So he decides to ask the owner permission to spend a couple of weeks there and do the proper research in order to publish a book about the house, in exchange of course for publicity for the house. So the owner says yes, and so he invites along his best friend. Their relationship has been on the rocks, and they decide to just, we like to do these things together, so let's do it one more time and see if we can build our friendship back up. And so they go to this house, and the house has no electricity, no water running. It's a very dire situation, and it is so creepy. Like, it's so creepy. If you like haunted houses stories, and if you like a bit of like a slow but very atmospheric horror, 12 Nights at Rotherhouse is amazing. I would love to know what you thought about the book if you read it. And last one, now this is also a thriller, but while I was gonna mention The Devil of Nanking in this video as well, which is my favorite book. And that kind of, it's not categorized as horror. and I understand why. While this, it's definitely a thriller, but it's also psychological horror and a horror fiction, categorized on Amazon as such, and I do agree that this is definitely very Halloween if you want to go more into the realm of crime, so terrifying crime that doesn't necessarily, it's not like a true crime, it's not a true story, but it does kind of give vibes of you're reading a true crime almost. But you're not, it's fiction. Thank God it's fiction. And this is Dean Koontz Intensity. Now, Dean Koontz Intensity, again, is one of my favorite books ever. I've done a video about my favorite books, the link down below. And this is a book that it's Adrenaline, translated into a book. It's very far-fetched, and it's the story of this young woman, China. She spends a holiday from university at her friend's house in California. She's invited there just for, I don't know if it's summer break, spring break, or Thanksgiving, something of the sort. So we travel there to this friend's house, we have dinner with her lovely parents, and then she's woken up in the middle of the night by weird noises, and she soon finds out that something horrible is happening inside the house. And whoever is inside the house, so there is an element of a home invasion, she has to follow in order to try and save her friend. I'm gonna keep it very vague. It does happen in the first 50, not even probably 30 pages of the book. So it's a very quick start, and it's a spiral into a twisted, sick mind of whoever is behind these, and the bad guy in these, and the writing of these are so deep. Yes, none of the decisions of our main protagonist in this make much sense. No one with survival instinct would ever go down the route that our protagonist does in this. I found the bad guy absolutely terrifying. Like, I wanted to sleep with my lights on for a few nights after reading these. I also found the introspection that we get, for how much we get in the bad guy, and the writing extremely good. So yeah, if you are in for a ride and you don't like sleep, and you like to then start, you know, looking above your shoulders when you are in a dark alley or whether it's the case, this is a perfect book to read. And I can guarantee you that if you start reading these on the 30th of October, you're gonna be done by Halloween night, just because this book is so compelling. You can't put it down. You'll be done in 2 days. I was done in just probably 2 days. I just couldn't stop reading. I needed to find out what was next. Poor Adrenaline, and I can't think about a better way of spending the last 2 days of this month. But Rotterhouse and Intensity are the top of the food chain when it comes down to horror books for me. But yeah, guys, thank you for watching. Let me know your recommendations down below. What is your favorite horror book ever? Maybe I've read it, maybe not. And if I've not read it, I would love to read it. So yeah, let me know. If you're new, I would love for you to subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Take care of yourself. Ciao!